Dr. Owens, first of all, thank you for your incredible service to our country. The Silver Star is just amazing, and we're just so honored to have you on today. And we want to just ask that you give a few opening comments on our topic today, which is civilian control of the military and how it contributes to our Constitution's checks and balances. And then we'll go to questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Uh, First, I think we can all agree that civilian control of the military is a cornerstone of Republican government, but it's really complicated. We always have to ask the question: exactly what does that mean? Uh, it's complicated by the fact that it's divided between Congress and the presidency, and they compete in many respects for dominance in that area. So with Article 1, for instance, Congress has the power of the purse. It has the power of appointments and confirmations. It also writes regulations and helps organize the various departments within the executive branch, including what is now the Department of Defense. Of course, it also has the responsibility for declaring war. In Article 2, the president is commander-in-chief of the military. He directs its use. He controls the executive branch. And the military is basically required to 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 obey the orders, lawful orders of the president and his subordinates. Now, this division was purposeful. And that, I think, is one of the interesting points here, is that the real genius of the founders was to establish a government designed to protect the natural rights of American citizens. And the best way to do that was to basically create this division of labor basically within the Constitution. So essentially, efficiency in departments like Department of Defense and so forth were sacrificed to ensure this protection of rights. And the key, I think, to what we're talking about here is Federalist 47 and 51. In Federalist 47, Madison writes that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, judicial, in one set of hands is the very definition of tyranny. In 51, he basically lays out a blueprint for pitting one branch of the government against the other. These are the checks and the balances and so forth. So the wisdom of the founders is basically not to establish an efficient government, but that means that in many respects, the struggles that result are not pretty. When it comes to basically the organization of the various departments, we first start with the department, the War Department, was established in 1789, the Navy Department in 1798. And that basically was the main organization through the 19th centuries. You get some major reforms in 1903. And of course, the key, which we're operating under now, is the Defense Organization Act of 1947, which changed the War Department and the Navy Department to the Department of Defense. Most recently had the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which basically established the power of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the basically military commands throughout the world. Now, the issues in the struggle here between what constitutes civilian control is, you can say, the too much civilian control can weaken the military effectiveness by focusing on non-military issues. On the other hand, too much military power can basically, of course, lead to militarism. Uh, for instance, the Prussian state is the example of something that Americans have wanted to avoid over their period of the Constitution. Prussia was referred to as an army with a state. That is sort of the essence of militarism. The dangers associated with that basically are a coup d'etat. We've been very fortunate in that we have never had that in the United States, although we may have come close, especially during the generalship of George Washington during the Revolution, when there was a basically what amounted to a mutiny, a near mutiny by officers in Newburgh, New York. But that was diffused by Washington himself. Uh, what we're faced with these days, I think, is more dangerous, which is Victorianism. During the period of the Roman Empire, Victorians were the guards of the emperor. The problem was that after a period of time, they decided who the emperor was going to be, and in many cases assassinated their their opponents and replaced others or put others in his place. Again, it's usually associated with what's called deep states, with uh, like Turkey and Egypt in the most recent periods. But those are the two extremes, I think. Um, One of my arguments, basically, and this is where we are today, is that civil military relations in the United States, including the question of civilian control, is a bargain between three parties: the government, the military, and the people. And periodically, this is renegotiated as circumstances change, as technology develops, as geographical, geopolitical circumstances change. So we have been in the past few years at a point where this renegotiation is taking place, and you see it, I think, during the Trump administration and some of the affairs that we've been facing recently. So one of the big questions, of course, is the role of the military, and that is part of the debate and part of the struggle that the founders set up in trying to avoid military government and making sure that civilians were in control in a reasonable way and designed to protect the rights of our citizens. So let me stop there.
Well, thank you. Those are great opening comments. And I know we have a lot to discuss and a lot of questions. So, Janine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Am I on? Yeah, I am.
Yep.
Hello. Thank you so much. And again, I echo the sentiments of thanking you for our service to our country. Thank you so much. Um, I'd like to go back to the elementary standpoints for our students that are in middle school and whatnot. Can you define a standing army and how in the Constitution our founding fathers no longer wanted a standing army and why? Because I think it goes back to the Republic of Rome and Julius Caesar, but it also had to do with kings and queens having an army at their disposal. But they didn't want a standing army, and I think now we have one. So, do you want to kind of explain, I think, to keep it simple, the elementary aspect of why our founding fathers did not want a standing army, as well as I believe that George Washington was very intent on saying he was a citizen soldier. And when he was finished with his job, he was going to hand over his sword and let Congress take control, and how different that was from the kings and queens and the dictators and the republic with Julius Caesar and things of that nation, things of that sort. So if we could just kind of start with the that they did not want a standing army, and why?
Okay, well, the founders preferred militia, basically citizen soldiers who were civilians during most of the time. But when a period of danger would arise, they would rally to the flag. Um, a lot of this comes out of the British tradition, as you mentioned. But one of the changes that took place in Britain was that the question was if Parliament was able to control the military, then it was not a threat to Republican government. And I think that founders like Washington himself and like Hamilton uh, really pushed to have a small standing army after the revolution, uh, very small. And eventually, after the failures of the War of 1812, they got something like that. But I think that the general idea is that you want to avoid a country which is run by the military. The military has the sword. The military is always the danger of standing armies or armies in general is that they can turn the sword on the government. And that was the reasoning of the founders. We do have I think because of, again, changed circumstances, the fact that we live in a period of possible unlimited war. We fought two great wars during the 20th century. That national security requires a standing army. We have the successor to the militia with the National Guard and so forth. But we have a kind of military that is essentially it's still volunteer, but it's standing in the sense that its funding is continued to defense budgets and appropriations.
Right. You want to just we've talked to this quite a lot, but it's still always a little bit confusing. The correlation between the militia, which the Constitution talks about at great length, which is, people in the states that are ready to come forth when needed, and what we have now, which is the National Guard.
Sure. Sure. Well, again, the militia was, as I pointed out, and as you acknowledged, was basically the citizen soldiers. They were mustered by the state, but as the Constitution says, if they're brought into military, if they're brought into national service, they are um, subject to the authority of the president and all that sort of thing. The traditional militia kind of went away after the failures of the War of 1812. It didn't perform very well. And so after that period of time, the whole standard of this separate states militia is replaced by state volunteers. So that's what you have, say, during the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War. But the idea of the citizen soldier is very part of the American tradition. Now, what we have in 1903 was the Dick Act, and I can't remember the official name of the representative Dick, who basically established the present situation with regard to the National Guard. It is a state organization, but it is also national. And since more and more of its funding comes from the federal government, federal government exercises more and more control over the National Guard. And that's the situation we have today. Back in the 1980s, I know there was a big kind of an argument basically to integrate the National Guard more specifically into war plans and the like. That's what Sam Nunn of Georgia, basically with Army divisions, for instance, one of their brigades would be a National Guard brigade. And so that's where we stand today. The National Guard is under state authority. It's officered by state officers and so forth, but can be called into national services. It has recently been in, say, Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
But the governor can call the National Guard for his state, can he not? Just
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
state.
So again, this is again the dual nature of the National Guard. It's of course leads to confusion, but ultimately the the federal power is dominant to the state power.
Hmm. Was it that way in the Constitution originally? Because it talked about militias originally in the Constitution. So
Yeah.
originally in the Constitution, were the state militias under the power of states and not federal government that could call them up? Did that change in 1903 with that document that you're talking about?
Well, that was the where the issue was finally to resolve. But say during the War of 1812, you know the militias were state. There was a lot of concern by the anti-federalists during that period of time that militias could be federalized, and that was a debate during the early part uh, of the republic. But the but again, go back to the fact that it's a dual nature, that it is state organization, but especially today, because of changes in the law and the like and regulations and so forth, uh, the federal the National Guard can be federalized. That's one of the big debates, well, of course, with say Los Angeles and Governor Newsom and so forth. Uh, the, the authority for nationalizing or calling the, the state guard into federal service, does that reside with the state or with the president? And the question is right now, you know, by usage, it is tended to be with the president. It's a last resort, and that's the key here is that we want to maintain state control for the most part. But if governors aren't doing what they're supposed to do, then there's the responsibility of the president to Republican government. Again, Republican with a small r, is to be able to use this force to ensure that the rights of American citizens are being protected.
And I only have like a minute left, but that seems rather confusing, I think, for the people who sign up for the National Guard as opposed to signing up for the Army, which it seems to me today we must definitively have a standing Army, which I don't have time to get into, which I don't think anybody really wanted, but I mean, our founders wanted, but it changes. But it seems to me in regard to the militia, which is now called the National Guard, that would be kind of confusing to them about where their loyalty is. I mean, what if the governor says, you cannot leave, I need you for the state. Does the federal government trumps that now? It's now a federal government, the militias.
Well, there was a decision back in the gosh, whenever it was in Ohio. The governor of Ohio wanted to prevent the Ohio National Guard from being sent to provide service in Latin America, and the Supreme Court basically ruled on the government's behalf. So again, if the two clash, the president's going to win.
Is that stated in the Constitution anywhere, though, or just in statutes?
No, because again, remember the Constitution is an outline. And a lot of things, of course, again, the establishment of these departments had to be based on laws that were passed by Congress. So a lot of the ambiguous nature of the things we're talking about were basically intended by the Constitution that had to be fleshed out later by statute law and
Yeah,
by
I need.
court
I,
decisions.
yeah, I need to toss to Tova, but it would be, or Jewel, it'd be really interesting. I don't know the answer to this question, but if the militia pledges their allegiance to the United States Constitution or to the state constitutions,
Both, but
both.
yeah.
See, that's confusing. I would think they'd be very confused if
Well,
push came to shove. I mean, if the governor's saying, stay here, and the president's like, come here, I would think that would be a little bit ambivalent. But I'll toss that. I'll let that question be picked up by my fellow host. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you again for your service to our country. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And Tova, will go to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And again, thank you for your service. This has been really interesting and such an important topic to be discussing. I wanted to ask about, what moments, maybe looking through American history, what are some moments where it seems like this vision of a civilian control of the army maybe was most under pressure, or sort of these pivotal points where the role of the military had to be redefined throughout American history?
Yeah, I think again we've been pretty fortunate in the sense that I can't think of any real serious efforts by the military to disobey, you know, the, the the lawful orders of a president and so forth. As I mentioned, probably the closest we came was at the end of the revolution, where basically we had signed uh, basically a peace with Great Britain. The army was still mobilized. It was in Newburgh, New York, but they hadn't been paid for a long time. And basically, a number of officers decided that they were going to put pressure on Congress. And that, of course, would have been a very dangerous precedent. And that was when Washington showed up at the meeting unannounced and basically, through his presence and his character, basically diffused it. And at the end of the meeting, all these officers basically were in tears because he pointed out that, or as he said one time when he put on some spectacles, he says, "You must pardon me, gentlemen, because I've not only grown gray in the service of our country, but also blind." And of course, that was the end of it. We've had, the possibilities. We've, as I say, been very blessed with a lack of coup d'etats, where other countries have faced these sorts of things. And basically any idea basically of a civilian takeover. I mean, the quintessential, if you want a great movie about the possibility, the old version called 7 Days in May, with one of the great casts of all time, is something to see about leading up to the possibility of a a military coup. Um, but again, we've been very blessed in that we have not been threatened, in recent times, certainly, by an outward coup. That doesn't mean one of the things I've been warning about lately is Praetorianism, this idea that the military is going to basically decide what it's going to obey and what it's not going to obey. And unfortunately, that's become normalized to a certain extent. And I've written on that recently, and I'm a little bit concerned about it. But so far, the Constitution and our legal system is held.
Very interesting. Thank you. In our Constituting America book club, we just read a book about that talked about that episode with George Washington and him sort of getting control back, but in a very like mature way that showed his character. So I wanted to go back to something you said in your introduction, where you spelled out that the military is required to obey the lawful orders of the president and his subordinates. And I was curious what would happen if the president did give an unlawful order? Like, how is that determined? How would the military react in that situation?
Well, I mean, that's so far it hasn't happened, but I don't know. I think that that there are debates about these sorts of things. Uh, I know a lot of people will complain about, say, President Trump's his decisions and so forth. And while reasonable people can disagree about these, I do, some of these things, he has not issued an unlawful order. But again, the idea would basically to conduct or to carry out war crimes, to launch a war without warning or something like that. But it's again, so far it hasn't happened, and I I pray that it doesn't in the future.
But if it did happen, like what would be the framework for addressing it? Or maybe if there's not a consensus yet, since we're lucky enough that it hasn't happened, are there like different sort of strains of thinking about what might happen? Could you give us an overview of that?
Well, it would be the obligation of the officers themselves to basically refuse and I guess, to do it first privately and then publicly if it didn't dissuade the president from issuing an unlawful order. And then we would see. I mean, the question would be loyalty, personal loyalty, or loyalty to the Constitution. And again, the oath that the military uh, uh, gives when upon enlistment or being commissioned is the loyalty to the Constitution, not personal loyalty to an individual. Sorry, I can't give you a more definitive answer.
No, I mean, I'm glad I'm glad our country has been historically in a place that we haven't had to, you know, have a definitive answer to that. And then I was just curious on a basic level, what does the role of commander in chief mean? Since, if Congress holds the power to declare war and fund the military, what is that role of commander in chief as the founders envisioned it and um, as it is today?
Yeah, well, basically, again, this is directly in the Constitution that the president is commander in chief of the military and the militia when in federal service, the National Guard, and that basically means that that's the question again. I'm sorry, I just had a. That's the question again.
The question is, what is the role of the commander in chief,
Oh, okay, yeah,
especially in light of the fact that, Congress declares war and funds the
yeah,
military? What's the president's role?
sure. Again, he through the executive branch, through the basically Secretary of Defense, um, through the combatant commands and so forth, gets to use the military that has been funded by the by the Congress. This goes all the way back to what was called the phony war at the turn of the century, quasi war with France, basically where the Navy was utilized against basically the French Navy, and then later during the what do you call it, the Barbary Wars and so forth. The idea that once basically funded, the president then had the authority to use it under most circumstances. Uh, Keep in mind, of course, we've only been 5 declarations of war, and there's the United States. One of the big questions, of course, is what does that mean these days? And I think that people will argue that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 and the authorization of the use of military forces during the Gulf War and after that constitute de facto declarations of war. The president has the authority to use the military again within limits to constitutional limits, and Of course, he can't use it for his own purposes.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. And thank you for laying it all out for us. And now I will pass on to the next panelist. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, Joel Gilbert here. Thanks so much, Tova and Janine and Kathy. And I have to say, is that a patriotic rugby shirt that you have on? This looks like what it says. I've played rugby for about 6 years, so I love the sport. It's a great game.
Yes,
So
indeed.
my first question is with my fellow rugby fan is, can you just give me an overview of maybe some pros and cons of what it means to have a civilian army? Because it's hard being as we grew up in America, that's something I almost take for granted. And it's hard to imagine what it would look like if we didn't have a civilian army. So maybe talking about some pros and cons of that would kind of bring that distinction out.
Yeah, the again the sort of idea when people talk about a objection to a standing long service professional army is Prussia, Germany, for instance. These soldiers constituted a force unto themselves. And the idea that even though we have clearly a volunteer force, which constitutes a standing force, it is still responsive to civilian control, because that basically is imbued, through my own experience, through teaching at the Naval War College for many years, through dealing with professional military education. That's something that the idea of civilian control is internalized by military officers and by soldiers and sailors as well. The idea basically that, they are not a rogue force that can do what it wants, that the responsibility lies to the American people. And that's the essence of military service these days. It has been, I think, certainly since I've been around, but even before that. I mean, World War II, you had a drafty army because we needed a large force. Now, one of the things that happened over the period of time is as technology changed, geopolitical circumstances changed, we didn't need an army like that. We needed one that was more technically proficient and could therefore be smaller to what we basically have now. So, our military force is considerably smaller than what it was during the Cold War, and that was smaller than what we had during World War II. So again, it's a response to changing circumstances. We have the kind of military today that I think we need, given technology, given geographic reality, and the like.
It's pretty amazing when you think about the individualistic nature, the rugged American, and then also the ambitious American, that we haven't had a coup. It also speaks to our patriotism and our unity of an ideal of the American spirit, and that our country is more than. And oftentimes, what we'll talk about it on Constitution of America is the founding documents linked to natural law and belief in something bigger, and America's founding documents appealing to that. And I'd have to say that I think that it seems like that is why we haven't had a military coup d'etat. Because if you're just thinking about it, a civilian-led military, strongest nation, strongest military in the world, where if you were an ambitious person, it's where you would go. But we haven't had that issue. Is that something that you think that you'd agree with, that it is because of the spirit of our founding documents?
Yeah, I think it's American culture, and I think American culture is shaped by the Constitution, the realities, the Declaration of Independence, those things we hold, you know, true to, and that yes, Americans are individualistic as they should be. And I mean, one of the ironies of military service is one of the first things they do is kind of break down this idea so they recognize yourself as part of a team, part of something larger, and so forth. But I think one of the successes of the military is it encourages, initiative. It encourages sort of individual behavior. And I mean, that may sound contradictory, but again, the American soldiers are different than the soldiers of other countries. I mean, I've dealt with many very good soldiers in different countries and so forth. But there's something special about about American soldiers, which can be traced to sort of the American character. And again, that American character has been shaped, I think, very much by the Constitution, by the societal factors that make the United States what it is.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating observation that although we think of military as sometimes part of what makes a soldier is being able to break down that individual to go into the good of the collective and be on a unit or a team. But also, you just highlighted that there is that individual initiative is rewarded or encouraged in the American Armed Forces. And that's very interesting to draw the distinction between other nations, especially for us on the call. I really have no frame of reference to compare anything to military wise, except for the American soldiers and veterans, which I've met. I don't think I've ever had a discussion with a foreign veteran about their service. So that's a really interesting observation for you to give us for someone who's had that. I have time for, I think, over a question. I wanted to go back to you've brought up a lot of different very interesting historical points, and you've brought out different aspects of the way that our military developed because of these historical occurrences and military endeavors. We talked briefly about the fact that the Congress declares war, but the executive has the ability to act for a short period of time before Congress has to declare war, and it's a debated issue about that. Now, what I wanted to kind of ask about that is in the beginning, for the way the founding fathers would have seen it, if the president's power is contingent on Congress completely to be able to be the commander in chief, if we're following the Constitution correctly, 100% correctly, would we be able to be an effective military force if Congress always had to telegraph to the whole world before we took military action? Or do I misunderstand the way the Constitution is written in that aspect?
Part of the problem, and this is something that again, usage has changed. The idea of a declaration of independence is not to say that, okay, we've been at peace and now by God we can go to war. A declaration of independence traditionally has been understood as we look at the situation and now a state of war exists between, say, the United States and Great Britain, as it did in 1812, because of something that Great Britain has done. We're now, basically, Congress is now acknowledging that. That's more of the traditional understanding of declaration of war. Somehow we got to this idea that the declaration of war means that, before this, that we've been completely at peace, and now we are going to authorize military force. There's some of that, but the fact is that you have to respond to circumstances, and that's what, say, happened, say, during the Mexican War or World War I or World War II. Basically, Japan attacked the United States in 1941. Okay, the president says, okay, basically, Japan has decided to go to war. We acknowledge that fact, and now we're going to take necessary steps. I think that kind of changed during the Cold War, the idea of nuclear weapons and the problems of surprise and the like. But I think that's the situation that really continues to prevail, is the idea that a declaration of war is merely the acknowledgement that that circumstances have changed. The president still has the power to employ the military, within his constitution constraints. And again, I think the Gulf of Tonkin, at least in terms of our practice, has said basically that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in which we used force against North Vietnam, was a recognition of the fact that we had been under attack by North Vietnamese forces. It's debated today about whether that ever really occurred, but it's still it's the principle, I think. Hope that answers your question.
It definitely does. That was a different perspective of understanding that declaration of war as recognizing a situation. So thank you very much. And it was awesome being able to speak to you. And now I think we have a bunch of audience questions.
Yes,
We
sir.
Thank you
you
for your service.
Thank you.
We do. And thank you, Jewel and Tova and Janine. And we first want to give a shout out to teachers and students and a new listener who's in our audience today. Maria Daniels, a new listener who says hello. And hello, Maria. Welcome to our podcast. Ann Hardy's a teacher watching who says hello. And Kenyon Wanis, a student watching. If you are a student or a teacher, especially watching today, and we didn't give you a shout out, be sure and type your name in the Q&A. And we're glad to give you a quick recognition before the end of the program. We also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you, Las Vegas, for tuning in. So we have got, as Jules said, we've got so many audience questions in the queue here, Dr. Owens, and we are going to start actually up top here with Andrew K., who says, would not universal mandatory military service move us back in the direction of the citizen soldier, especially in this age when most citizens do not have a need to be armed?
That has been debated, I guess, since the end of since the end of World War II. We had a draft until the 1970s. And the fact is, most of the people that make this argument make it from the standpoint of basically civic virtue. And there's an argument to be made for that. On the other hand, that is, I think, completely at odds with sort of the American tradition that military service should be voluntary. Now, again, how do you balance that against the draft? But again, the idea is that, our understanding of national security is that the individual is based against, the requirements of national security. And the compromise we had was, again, the draft, with certain restrictions that had been placed on individuals, and then later on the all voluntary force. And I think we have the kind of force right now that we need, at least in terms of the number of troops and the like. I've always been opposed to the idea of universal service, again, because I think that it is a counter to the American character. Again, perfectly good arguments on behalf of that, but I think that it also would not give us the kind of soldiers we need.
And then Andrew also asked a second question. To what degree has the elimination of the Atlantic Ocean as a protective moat changed the imperative for a standing army and air force, etc.?
Well, we have interest abroad. So yes, I mean, the fact is that, we've been very blessed in terms of being protected by two oceans. Of course, that went away with the development of long-range air power. We're subjective to ballistic missile attacks, cruise missiles, all these sorts of things. Still a possibility. But, our interest are basically, we've come up with the idea that the best way of protecting the homeland is to defend for it. That's why we have, since World War II, established a series of maritime alliances around Eurasia. Basically NATO, basically the our bilateral treaty with Japan and the like. So we have 4 military bases in other countries that, as we see that is the best way to protect American interests. Now that's debatable. A lot of people say, no, America, come on, we don't need to be deployed. That's imperialism. And again, those are kind of debates that I think will continue. But again, I think certainly, we are not in the business of, going out and looking for trouble. But on the other hand, our ability to defend forward makes it easier for us to diffuse these sorts of things where they become a threat.
Well, thank you. And then we also have going back to Tova's question about what would happen if the president had an unlawful order. We had a listener who texted in something that is basically a display at the U.S. Army Museum, which I would encourage everybody to go check out the U.S. Army Museum. It's fairly new, and it's in Virginia, down near Fort Belvoir. It's just a great institution. But at the U.S. Army Museum, there's a sign. It says, "What does the Constitution say?" The Constitution states that Congress has the power to raise and regulate an army, but it makes the president its commander. By separating these two functions, the Constitution ensures that no single person or group has sole control of the armed forces of the United States. Ultimately, the American people control the Army and other American military services through their elected officials in the federal government. And so, again, one reason why we have checks and balances that the Congress it could not fund something that the Congress deemed unlawful, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things the founders were concerned about was factions. And, there's always, the danger in other countries where, revolutionary faction seizes control of the military and uses it for their own purposes and so forth. The idea of, again, what you get with the checks and balances and the constitutional protections and the like are basically that constitutes a major protection against the use of the military by one group against another. And again, that sign is a very sound one to keep in mind. The U.S. military is defend the rights and freedoms and prosperity of the American citizen, the people as a whole.
Well, thank you. And Stephen Murray has a comment. He says Article 2, Section 2 mentions the Army, Navy, and militias. And I just happen to have my Constituting America Constitution and looked it up. It says the president shall be commander in chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. but may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments. And it goes on from there. But that goes to a second question by Lewis White, who says, "Is the National Guard truly the militia?" And Lewis says, "I believe the militia was only controlled by the state. Yes, they fought wars together, but always had their own leaders. The top leader would cooperate with others, but they always had their ability to make decisions, such as to go or not, whereas the president can call up the National Guard and have the full authority over it." Question mark.
Look, the national today's National Guard I think I argued earlier, is a compromise. It's um, it's basically um, shaped, funded by the states, not funded, but shaped and offered by the states. But those, uh, but the money for that, especially these days, and especially after the DIC Act of 1903, basically increasingly comes from the federal government. So, it's not truly a militia such as we had in, at the end of the revolution and the like. But again, that system went away a long time ago because of failures in the War of 1812. And since that time, we continue to come up with ways of providing state representation and the like. Even as late as World War One, we had basically state units, National Guard units that were basically mobilized and served the United States. Army divisions during World War One and World War Two served as army divisions, but under federal control, fighting the Germans and the Japanese. Um, so again, the shift in circumstances has been toward more federal control. They still have their state requirements that, the uh, uh, basically state emergencies, uh, the response to fires, response to hurricanes, and those sorts of things. But there's an ambiguity that that's going to continue until, um, I think, because it's just sort of the nature of the beast. It's a state organization, but increasingly, because it's funded more and more by the federal government, more and more under federal control.
Well, thank you. And then Tracy asked, you mentioned earlier some legislation that established the Department of Defense in either the late 40s or early 50s, and the positions of Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, et cetera. Can you describe a little bit what the actual, talk a little bit about the secretaries, the roles of the Secretary of Army, Secretary of Navy, Secretary of Air Force? Are they required to be civilians or at least retired for a number of years before they can serve in that role?
Yeah, look, the National Security Act, 1947, I might believe, that's the one that created. First of all, it changed the name from the Department of War to the Department of Defense. It also, one of the amendments very shortly after that is where the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of the Army um, and were cabinet positions. Well, now we're not, they're sub-cabinet. The only cabinet member from the Department of Defense is the Secretary of Defense. And as part of the National Command Authority, the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Air Force. Now we got a Department of Space Department, and so forth. These are civilian leaders, again, to reinforce the idea of civilian control. We recently, for a very long time, it was a requirement basically that a Secretary of Defense could not be a former officer who had to be separated for at least 10 years. We changed that for General Mattis. It was the first to do it since George Marshall did it. And the argument was, in both circumstances, these guys are special and we'll make an exception for them. But then so was Lloyd Austin. He was also former military and so forth. So we've, to a certain extent, abandoned that. I would like to see us get back to it because I think, again, we want to maintain as much as possible a delineation between civilian authorities and military forces.
Well, thank you. And we are right at the top of the hour. So we thank you so much for being on with us today and sharing your expertise. And thank you again for your incredible service to our country. And we thank our audience for all their great questions and our panel, Jorn and Jewel and Tova. So glad to have you back. And Janine. And ask everybody to join us next week, Tuesday at 2 Eastern. We're going to be talking about the role of the judiciary in checks and balances. So thank you so much, Dr. Owens.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.